After travelling for what seemed like hours, the train finally came to a station. Christopher looked out the window and saw the signpost on the platform. "Barrow in Furness," he asked to himself. "Should I even get off here?" His own counsel suggesting yes, he picked up his suitcase and walked out the door. The children and the other passengers, their luggage and some mail, were being transferred over to another train on the next track. There was even a vendor selling lace and toys to the children as gifts of pity and charity. The station master was reading his paper. Christopher walked up to him. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know where I can get to Appleby? It's in Westmoreland." "No trains to there, son. The next one's leaving for Sodor." "Sodor?" thought Christopher. "I never heard of it. Is it nice and safe? Is it magical?" "You're right, it is," smiled the station master. The train on the next track had 5 tan coaches constructed of wood, and it was pulled by what looked like an Elna A3 painted sky blue with the number 4 on its tender. Christopher viewed this as odd, since the Elna painted their engines green. "Must be a private," he thought before stepping aboard the second to last coach. A poop of the whistle and the train sped off across a large bascule bridge, stopping at a big station, through a pair of tunnels, arriving and departing from a few more stations, up and over a huge hill, and finally at a small station called Knapford, where Christopher saw the strangest sight he had ever seen. It was a tank engine, with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome, painted blue with red stripes, and it had the number 1 on its side tanks. But that was not all. The engine had a face, a perfectly human face that was grey, like the dead. Attached to the engine was a pair of bogie coaches with the names Annie and Clarabelle written on the sides. Christopher was so curious that he picked up his suitcase and got off the train to take a closer look. Walking onto the platform, he cautiously approached the engine. Only his eyes moved, watching some of his passengers being transferred onto his coaches. "Thanks for the load, Gordon," the lips said, causing Christopher to flinch backwards. The engine, dubbed Gordon, left in a cloud of steam. Then the tank engine's eyes made contact with the boys. "If you want to take a picture," said the tank engine, "why not do it now? Maybe it will last longer." "I don't have a camera with me," Christopher apologized. "If I did, then maybe—" His words switched onto, for lack of a better choice of words, switched onto another track. "How can you speak?" "That's a question I've never really thought of myself until now," the tank engine said. "It's a mystery that makes this island so magical." "Well," said Christopher, reflecting back on his wish, "I did want to go to someplace magical. Guess my luck turned up today." "And you should be. The island doesn't receive too many visitors." "How come?" "Because no one seems interested. It's almost as if it was not on the map or anything." Silence followed for 5 seconds. "But we haven't been introduced. I'm Thomas." "Christopher Audrey." Thomas eyed the boy quizzically. "Did you say your name was Audrey?" "That's my last name, isn't it?" Before Thomas could say anything, the guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. "I'll tell you when we get to my shed," said Thomas quickly. "Hop into my cab." Christopher climbed into the cab, where he met Thomas's driver and fireman, and off they went. Complete with the view he had seen on the way there, Sodor was a bright and colourful world that Christopher had never seen before. They rolled past an airfield with aeroplanes, a quick stop at a station called Toryrek, over a bridge at Elsbridge where they could see people fishing, past a field where a tractor was hard at work ploughing the earth, past a cottage by the line, through a tunnel, and finally they arrived at the station of Farquhar, where Thomas was said to live. The last evacuees were dropped off, and Christopher went to speak to Thomas. "So, what did you want to ask me about my last name?" 25 years ago, during the last war, a little boy by the name of Wilbert Audrey came with me to Sodor the first time, along with his father and half-brother. Their visit wasn't too long, though, since Carol had been called away to war. Then he died, and pretty soon Wilbert and Vera had to go home and resume their normal lives. "That's my father's name, Wilbert." Christopher was amazed. "I'm his son." "You are?" Thomas felt like the heart in his boiler was twisted in a knot. "Where is he now?" "Westmoreland, I suppose," Christopher said. "I must have gotten on the wrong train." "Do you want to go back to them?" "I would like to," said Christopher. "But this place, it's so enchanting and magical that I want to stay." "You can stay at my house," said Thomas's fireman. "I've got a wife and daughter at home. I'm sure she'd love to have you for company." "What is she like?" Christopher asked. "Quite lovely," the fireman replied. They walked to the house next door to where the station master lived, and there Christopher was introduced to the fireman's wife, Mrs. Checkley, who was finishing up a nice little sandwich. "Who did you bring home, dear?" she asked when she saw Christopher. Mr. Checkley gave his wife a peck on the cheek and sat down. Christopher set his luggage by the front door. "This is Christopher," he said. "He's an evacuee." Mrs. Checkley checked the name tag. "Seems to me he was supposed to go to a family named Dalby." "Those are my dad's friends," Christopher corrected. "I hear he's in the RAF." "Is your father in the army?" "No, he's reverend and a pacifist. He's been that way since my half-uncle Carol died in Verdun." Coming down the stairs was the pitter-patter of Mary Jane's shoes, belonging to a 9-year-old girl with strawberry blonde hair. She stared at Christopher with love-struck eyes. "Have you brought me home a boy, Mum?" "No, your father did. Elaine, this is Christopher, who's going to live with us." Christopher nervously waved back. He wasn't used to strange girls whose personalities were not alike to that of his sisters. Besides, she looked very attractive. They sat down at the table. Mrs. Checkley handed the children 2 plates of sandwiches while the fireman turned on the radio. Franz Liszt's Piano Concerto No. 2 in A major began to fill the room with strains of classical music. Elaine slowly ate her sandwich while Christopher listened. "Do you often listen to the radio at home?" she asked Christopher. "Sometimes, but not very often. My daddy and I sometimes go off and watch the trains go by." "Well, aren't you lucky? My neighbor Diana and I go off aboard Thomas sometimes and we help him out. Her father's driver, you should know. Can I meet her? Maybe tomorrow you should get settled in." Elaine turned to her mother. "Mum, since Christopher's going to stay with us, do you think he could sleep in my room?" Christopher had sometimes slept with Hilary and Veronica whenever they got scared. But Elaine's case, she was an entirely different girl, somebody he wasn't ready for. With a quick, "Could you excuse me?" he jumped up from the table, turned and hurried out of the house. He ran outside to where Thomas was taking on water. "Thomas, do you think I could sleep with you? Where you sleep, I mean. I'm not sure if I want to sleep in Elaine's room. I've only just met her." "You can," Thomas smiled. "My shed is right nearby the houses." Thomas turned his eyes to a single shed located on the track in front of the houses. Next to it was a carriage shed reserved for Annie and Clarabelle. "The next to us is reserved for us," the coaches said. Christopher's eyes widened. Even the coaches on this island could talk too. Later that night, Thomas's driver and fireman set up a hammock for Christopher to sleep in. It was positioned to Thomas's left on a small boarded platform reserved for the driver and fireman. Christopher took out his toothbrush, the clothes he was going to wear tomorrow, his food, a parcel carrying his gas mask and his pyjamas, and set them on the floor. First he changed into his pyjamas, which were short in the arms and legs from the summer season of boys' clothing, and emerged from behind Thomas's rear, which kept the engine from looking at his private areas. "Aren't you cold?" Thomas asked. "I'm used to it," said Christopher. "Sometimes I even sleep without my shirt on." He climbed onto the hammock and pulled the covers over him. "Well, good night." Christopher closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. Every night, ever since he was 3, Wilbert would tell him stories of trains and railways, like the ones Grandfather Vere told Wilbert when he was a little boy living in Ampfield. Christopher wanted so very much for his father to be right there next to the bed, comforting him with his sweet, storytelling voice. But for now, he had to settle with a substitute. "Thomas, do you think you could tell me a story?" "Like what?" "Maybe how you came here, how you knew my dad. That way we can know each other better." Thomas poured out his story. At some point around 1913, Vere, Wilbert and the rest of their family spent their time in Brighton, watching the trains of the LBSCR coming and going as their favourite pastime. When Thomas was built, Wilbert went over to take a closer look at the engine, therefore becoming the first person Thomas ever saw the moment he opened his eyes to the world. With German Zeppelins fast approaching England, Vere, Wilbert and Carroll Edward, who had signed on to serve the Sodor Regiment, travelled to the island to get away from there, where they met the railway's controller Topham Hatt and another engine named Edward. "But then, as I have stated before," finished Thomas, "Carroll Edward was called away to war, so Wilbert and Vere went back to the mainland." "My dad told me a few stories about Uncle Carroll," said Christopher. "His death is what led him to becoming a pacifist. But I want to know something else. Did you say you were a shunter?" "I was a shunter, a station pilot if you may. But I got tired of pushing coaches, and I wanted to see the world beyond my yard outside the island. It all started when Henry, our number 3, got ill. So I volunteered to take his train and set off, only to find out that I left the coaches behind. How did that happen? The shunter forgot to couple them. Anyway, after that little mishap, Edward offered me to take some trucks to his station. They pushed me down the hill, and I nearly crashed into the buffers. The Fat Director told me to shunt trucks around Edward's yard for a few days so I could learn more about them. Eventually, when James came to the island and had an accident on his first day, I took the breakdown train to help clear up the mess, and the Fat Director gave me a branch line all to myself with Annie and Clarabelle as my personal coaches. Is that all? No. I had many other adventures on my branch line after that. First, I left Clarabelle's guard behind. Then I met a tractor named Terence, who helped me out of a snowdrift, and had a race with a bus named Bertie, who thought that roads were better than rails. I won the race, and we have been best friends ever since. We could do another race again, but that seems very unlikely." Christopher was silent, amazed by the story before Thomas asked him. "So, did you like the story?" "Yes," replied Christopher. "But I'm tired. Can we meet the other engines tomorrow?" "Of course we can. Good night, Thomas." As Christopher cuddled himself in the blankets, Thomas whispered, "Good night, Christopher." Thomas fell fast asleep, and Christopher began to dream. In his dreams, he saw his dad opening his arms out for a hug. Christopher ran up to him and hugged him very tightly. He was joined shortly by his mother, sisters, and uncle. Christopher never wanted to let go. He felt safe and comfortable, not wanting it to end. But even so, he whispered 3 final words before the sleep took a strong hold on him. "Good night, Daddy." Meanwhile, at the Dalbys' house in Appleby, the rest of the Audreys had already settled in. But when they noticed that Christopher was missing, they began to worry. Where was he now? As he went to sleep, Wilbert sent a little prayer to all the stars in the universe and whispered, "Good night, Christopher."